I'm Madison Carter. Last week, I walked into my sister's trial, uninvited, unnoticed. I sat quietly in the back row, saying nothing, until the judge looked up, stared directly at me, and said, "Governor Carter." The entire courtroom froze. My mother went pale. Julia lowered her head. And the people who once called me a failure had no words left. I didn't say a thing. But that silence rewrote the entire story they had once told on my behalf. If you've ever walked away from your family in silence, and come back not to reclaim their love, but to make sure they never dare erase you again, leave a comment, hit like or subscribe to hear more stories like this one. If there was one word always attached to my name in the Carter family, it was failure. I can't pinpoint exactly when that label took hold. I just know it started the moment I applied for a graduate program in public administration. Not finance, not business, not anything my mother ever boasted about at family gatherings. Evelyn didn't argue. She simply looked up from her teacup, offered a faint smile, and said, "Not everyone is born to stand out. Sweetheart, someone has to be the backdrop." Since then, she'd often repeat that line during family events, her gentle explanation for why I was missing from so many photos. When I didn't come home for Christmas the following year, my aunt asked about me, and my mother simply shrugged. "She's busy trying to find herself." No one asked further, because in my family, disappointment came dressed in politeness, and exclusion was always wrapped in something called concern. I tried texting. I considered coming home. I even booked flights to Portland, but after each brief conversation with my sister Julia, I canceled. "Don't bother coming back, you'll ruin Mom's mood," she'd say, light as an afterthought. I understood the message my presence wasn't welcome, because I wasn't playing the part they had assigned me, the grateful, silent daughter who never outshined her sister. Then came Julia's third DUI arrest. My mother called, not to ask if I was okay, but to see if I could send a few $1,000s to bail Julia out. She said she didn't want this to leave a stain on Julia's legal record. I declined, politely, firmly, and after that call, I was no longer the lost daughter. I became the thorn in her side, a living reminder of everything she didn't want to face. She told relatives I was ungrateful, selfish, heartless. I know because my uncle told me, and I wasn't surprised. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't react. I'd learned that in homes where silence is considered peace, the first person to speak is always seen as the problem. So I stepped back. Not because I lost, but because I refused to keep acting in a play where I was never allowed to write my own lines. They thought I had disappeared from the family story, but I was just standing outside, watching, waiting for my turn to rewrite the ending. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. I didn't notify the court. I didn't call a single person in my family. I just went alone. No assistant, no security detail, no nameplate. That morning, standing outside the Multnomah County Courthouse, I looked at the old gray brick steps I'd walked past hundreds of times in my career as a public servant. But today, I have come in a different capacity, one thing no one inside that courtroom could have possibly expected. Julia's hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m., a minor case, nothing serious in terms of criminal charges, but notable because the name Carter sat squarely in the middle of the file, a name my mother used to be so proud to flaunt in the local paper. I entered the courtroom just as the clerk began calling the involved parties. The room wasn't large, but it was packed. Family, journalists, a few law students observing for their internships. I moved quietly through 2 rows of benches and chose the last seat by the wall. No one turned to look. I sat still, hands resting on my lap, shoulders straight, eyes forward, as if I were just another stranger curious about a random hearing. Julia was seated in the front row on the left, wearing a buttoned-up cream blouse, her hair neatly tied back, eyes fixed on the paperwork her attorney had just handed her. I'd seen her in many circumstances, but never like this, never so prepared, maybe because this time, things had truly slipped beyond her control. My mother sat on the right, wearing a pale gray suit, clutching her familiar leather handbag like it was some kind of talisman. She was whispering to someone, maybe an acquaintance in the legal field, or maybe just trying to convince herself that everything would be fine. Her face remained composed, but her hands tightened around the straps of that bag with a rhythm of quiet unease. Judge Holloway entered, his heavy black robe sweeping with his familiar gait. He had served in that court for nearly 2 decades. His experience had etched his face into a near-permanent mask of neutrality. Cases far more serious than this one had passed under his gaze without a flicker of emotion. He nodded, put on his glasses, and began flipping through a thick file, over 200 pages. The courtroom murmured softly, keyboards tapping from the clerk's desk, an occasional sigh from someone unseen. Then, he stopped, right at the bottom of the notes section. He looked up and scanned the room, as if trying to confirm something impossible. His eyes locked on mine, and didn't move. The entire room seemed to fall a beat behind. He leaned slightly toward the microphone, his voice low but clear enough to carry, "Excuse me, is Governor Madison Carter present in this courtroom?" No one answered. No one had time to. Julia's attorney looked up, lips moving slightly, as if struggling to process the question. The court clerk dropped their pen. An older man in the front row whispered to his wife. Even the police officer by the door leaned slightly forward. Julia's head snapped up, her face frozen. She looked at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. But I said nothing. I didn't rise. I just sat there, quiet, hands on my lap, and gave a single nod, just enough to confirm, not enough to be mistaken for showmanship. My mother turned pale. For the first time in my life, she looked like she didn't know what to do. She turned toward Julia, her lips moving, but no sound came out, no explanations, no script prepared for this moment. Judge Holloway regained composure quickly. He sat upright, closed the file, and said simply, "This hearing is adjourned. I need to reevaluate the conditions for proceeding, given the current circumstances." No one in that room knew what would happen next. But I did. In that precise moment, every old definition of who I was shattered. No one could see me as the lost daughter anymore. No one dared call me a failure again. And I didn't need to remind them who I was. I only needed to sit there and let the truth speak for itself. I didn't stand up, and I didn't speak. I just sat there, shoulders square, face composed, eyes fixed on the bench like any other citizen attending a public hearing. But the room was no longer the same. The atmosphere had shifted. People began glancing at one another, trying to confirm if what they'd just heard was real. Some whispered, some avoided looking at me, and some, like my mother, still couldn't bring themselves to believe it. Judge Holloway blinked slowly, removed his glasses, leaned back in his chair, then turned to the clerk. His voice dropped, but every word carried a new and unmistakable weight. "This court will stand in recess. I am making a preliminary finding of a possible conflict of interest, due to the presence of an individual holding executive authority at the state level." He lifted his head, looked straight at me once more, and gently closed the case file, as if it had just become something fragile. I didn't move, I didn't smile, didn't nod again. Everything was already clear. My presence, uninvited, unacknowledged, had now become the reason the entire court had to reconsider its proceedings. No need for a statement, no need to take the mic, and that, precisely, was what unsettled those who once dismissed me. Julia bowed her head, and for the first time in her life, she looked like someone truly facing consequences. She no longer pretended to read the documents. She wasn't whispering to her attorney, she just stayed still, as if trying to disappear from view. But no one in that room could look away anymore. Her lawyer, a sharp, middle-aged man, flipped through several pages quickly, whispering with urgency, clearly recalculating his entire defense strategy. But all of those calculations now had to operate under a new reality. This was no longer a simple family matter. It had just become a public issue. And my name now appeared in the case file, not as a party involved, but as an undeniable presence. My mother still sat there, her hand gripping her handbag tightly, shoulders slightly tense, as if everything unfolding before her was a dream gone off script. The same woman who once declared that Madison just doesn't have leadership qualities was now seated exactly 7 rows away from the person she'd called a failure. But those 7 rows, this morning, marked the distance between someone dismissed and someone with the authority to halt an entire hearing. The room fell silent. No one dared speak aloud. No one dared move too quickly. And above all, No one dared meet my eyes. There were only furtive glances, sidelong stares, all carrying the same emotion, unease. Not because I was angry, not because I posed a threat, but because I said nothing at all. Silence, at times, is the clearest declaration of power. I had once sat at the family dinner table, listening to my mother praise Julia's accomplishments, while I was described with phrases like still finding her path or just needs more time to settle down. I had been present at family gatherings where people talked about me like I was a sensitive subject, and I had stayed quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew that, at the time, my words didn't carry enough weight to be heard. But now, things were different. No one saw me as a shadow anymore. No one dared underestimate my place in a room filled with judges, attorneys, journalists, and law students watching closely. The balance had shifted, and they knew it. I hadn't asked for their attention, but in the end, they had no choice but to pay it. Not because I changed, but because they no longer had the power to ignore me. I didn't come to prove anything, not to confront, not to show up at just the right moment like they often say about people who succeed and come back seeking justice. I didn't come in the name of the governor of Oregon. No badge, no entourage, no reserved seat. I was just a woman who quietly walked into a courtroom and sat in the back row, because she had once been erased from every frame by the very people sitting in that room. When the judge paused the hearing due to a potential conflict of interest, I didn't feel victorious. I felt the truth. Nothing left to pretend. No more room for the roles they used to play. The same roles my mother had carefully directed at family gatherings, where I'd stay quiet while Julia told stories about fake international work trips or relationships that never lasted more than 3 months. I had sat in that very house before, eating Christmas dinner like a shadow, not because I had nothing to say, but because every word I spoke was deemed too blunt, too emotionless, too serious. Every time I tried to be honest, my mother would look at me like I had just spoiled the mood, and Julia would give a small laugh, then change the subject. Those years taught me how to exist like air, present but unseen, heard but never listened to. So today, as I sat quietly at the back of the courtroom, I didn't think I was doing anything out of the ordinary. I was simply keeping the role I'd always had, the observer. But this time, the room could no longer keep performing while pretending I wasn't there. Something shifts when you stop trying to join a conversation you were never invited to. When you sit down, not to be heard, but to see who still dares to pretend you're invisible. I once left my mother's house with nothing but an old suitcase and a partial scholarship. No one saw me off. No one asked where I was going. No one called during my first year living in Salem, on the 3rd floor of a walk-up with no elevator. But I learned how to fix a leaky faucet, calculate taxes for my part-time jobs, and rewrite what I believed about my own worth. They didn't know how far I'd come. They didn't need to, because to them, I was just Madison, the one who never quite fit in. But when that name was called in the middle of the hearing, all those old distances collapsed. Not because I suddenly became important, but because they no longer controlled the narrative. In that moment, I was no longer the cold, distant, unfeeling daughter my mother used to describe. I was no longer the too rational to be close sister Julia whispered about to our relatives. I was the woman who had stayed away long enough for them to believe I'd never return. But now, I was here, not saying a word, and they had no choice but to face me. I didn't walk into that room to remind them of who I am. I just sat down, and that presence alone, just that, was enough to completely shift the balance in a space where I once didn't exist at all. I left the courtroom in the same silence with which I had entered. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. But as the door to the hallway opened, I knew immediately I was no longer invisible. The corridor leading to the main exit already had a few reporters stationed there. They had initially come to cover what they thought was a routine DUI case involving a well-off local family. They had expected a forgettable hearing, a short filler story a few lines long. But then, their eyes landed on me. They looked at each other, whispered, confirmed, and like a domino effect, cameras were lifted, microphones extended, voices overlapping. Governor Carter, can you confirm in what capacity are you attending this hearing? Is the defendant a relative of yours? Why hasn't there been an official statement from the governor's office? I stopped, not out of surprise, but because I had known this moment would come. I looked directly at a female reporter standing closest, sharp haircut and unblinking gaze, and replied in a calm, steady voice, I'm here in a personal capacity. Then I walked on. No explanation, no deflection, no headline-making soundbite. I had learned long ago that the more you say, the more people twist your words. So I let them write. Let the image speak where words never could. And they did write. Not just one, but dozens of articles. The photo of me sitting in the back row of the courtroom, dressed in a deep navy suit, eyes steady, while my mother and Julia stared in shock, spread across news outlets in less than a day. A local paper asked the first pointed question, how could her mother and sister not know that the woman they once excluded from family dinners is now the governor of the state? A larger magazine in D.C. ran the headline, When Silence Speaks. Madison Carter's quiet return stuns family and media. They didn't need much detail. All they needed was that one photo, and that image became the most powerful wordless headline I've ever had. On social media, the photo circulated with captions like, "This is why you never underestimate the quiet daughter." And she didn't come to make noise. She came so they could never ignore her again. No one cared what the original case had been about anymore. No one focused on Julia's charges. All they saw was a woman who had once been excluded from her family's decisions, now sitting silently in a room where no one could forget who she was. I didn't have to make a statement. That photo did it for me. One gaze, one presence, one moment captured at the exact second the old order fell apart. And people began asking a question I had never once heard from my own family. How could someone rise so far? And her family not know I didn't answer that question, because even they, the ones asking, were starting to understand that some answers don't live in words, but in an absence so long, so undeniable, that it can no longer be covered by any excuse. That night, when I returned to my small apartment in Salem, the only thing breaking the stillness of the room was the glow from my phone screen. My mother, 3 missed calls, Julia, 8, unknown numbers, not saved, 12, and countless unread messages, most of them displaying only the first few words Madison, I need, or hey. I just wanted to say. I stared at the phone as if I were looking at something unfamiliar. What was once the only thread connecting me to my family had now become the most vivid evidence of a chaos I no longer belonged to. I didn't return a single call, not out of spite, but because I'd learned that sometimes. Silence is the only response powerful enough to make others truly listen. I placed the phone face down on the table. The next morning, when the city was still blanketed in fog, I was already in my car on the way to the Capitol. The meeting on foster care reform was scheduled for 8 a.m., and as always, I arrived 15 minutes early. The third-floor conference room still carried the scent of new wood after renovations, with soft golden light spilling across the long table where experts, lawmakers, and social organization reps waited. Everyone stood as I entered. I nodded in greeting. No introduction needed. Today's agenda: budget proposals for programs supporting youth who age out of the foster system without stable housing. A complex topic, difficult to quantify, often pushed to the margins during budget season. But to me, this was the beginning, because my mother, Evelyn Carter, once looked me square in the face when I chose to study social policy and said something I would never forget. You're not suited for these emotional things. You're always too rational, cold, distant. Those were the labels they gave me. Just because I didn't cry on cue, didn't bow my head at the right moments, didn't play the supporting role. But that morning, when I presented on the foster care system, when I spoke about a 16-year-old who had been moved through 4 placements in a single year, about how these young people didn't need pity but stability, about how they needed the law to stand with them, not one person in the room dared say I lacked emotion. I spoke clearly, slowly, with data, with experience, with understanding that didn't come from textbooks, but from the very feeling of being on the outside of a family I once belonged to. And when the meeting ended, one of the program directors stood, turned to me, and quietly said, "Thank you. Not just for understanding the issue, but for seeing the people inside it. I smiled gently, but inside, I felt something deeper than satisfaction. I knew. Somewhere else. My mother was scrolling through headlines, trying to make sense of why the phone kept ringing with no one answering, wondering how her daughter, the one she once believed was lost, was now shaping the very policies she thought I was too unfeeling to care about. I didn't need her to understand. I only needed her to know that some things I do are not for recognition. I do them because I know what it feels like to be lost, and that no one, not even a child with no one to call home, should ever be made to feel that way by default. And me, after years of being mislabeled, misunderstood, and misnamed, finally found a place where I didn't have to shout to be heard. And the first thing I learned there was that sometimes, the right to remain silent is the clearest voice of all. That night, when I came home, the hallway lights had gone out earlier than usual. My apartment sat on the 8th floor, facing the Central Park, where a few scattered figures walked beneath the pale yellow glow of street lamps. I brewed a pot of chamomile tea, opened my laptop, and prepared to review the meeting transcript to finalize the resolution draft. Everything unfolded as it usually did, quiet, orderly, and without requiring emotions to surface. Until my phone buzzed softly. Not a call this time. A message. Sender Julia. No greeting, no preamble. Just 3 short sentences: I'm sorry. You knew. You should have told me. You could have helped me avoid this. I set my teacup down and looked at the words on the screen, slowly, steadily. The apology came late, but it wasn't unexpected. Julia had never taken full responsibility for anything until every exit had closed. Maybe she meant it, or maybe she was just afraid. I didn't try to guess. I just read. And exhaled. Slowly. I rewrote my reply 3 times. I almost told her about all the times I was treated like a stranger in my own home. I almost reminded her of my 24th birthday, when she stood up to accept a gift in the middle of my living room. Because Mom said, "It suits Julia better." I almost asked, "Have you ever sat where I have? Unmentioned, unchecked on, unchosen." But I erased it all. I thought of the truth. Truth doesn't need embellishment. It doesn't need accusation. It only needs to be placed down, like a clean sheet of paper, unmarked but impossible to tear away. I sent Julia one single line: "You had their protection." I only had silence. No blame. No retelling. A reply so light it couldn't be called retaliation, but so heavy, no one could read it without pausing. A few minutes later, the message was marked read. No response. I didn't expect one. I turned off my phone, went back to my desk, opened the file folder, but something in me had just drifted away. Lighter than forgiveness, deeper than explanation. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need anyone to finally understand me. With just one sentence, I had redrawn the boundary between Julia and me, not with anger, but with a truth she could no longer escape. Some verdicts don't need to be delivered with force. They just need the right timing. And silence. That message, for me, was a period, not to the relationship, but to the expectation that someone will learn how to hold you when they never even learned to see you. Sometimes, the gentlest words are the clearest. And after everything, that was the only thing I wanted Julia to understand. 2 days after Julia's message, I received a call from a blocked number. Not just an unknown number, the kind someone chooses to hide, because they don't want to be declined before they even speak. I answered, not out of curiosity, but because I knew sooner or later that voice would return. And just as I expected, it was my mother. "Madison," she said, her voice soft and steady, as if calling from the end of a long hallway where every syllable needed careful calculation. "I didn't know. I didn't realize you had come this far. Your father and we just thought you were avoiding us, that you were angry." I said nothing. My silence wasn't to punish her, but to let her hear, with clarity, every word she had just spoken, words that were far too late and far too familiar to the old roles she used to play. She continued, "Julia is in real trouble, Madison. They're considering revoking her license permanently. There's a chance, not even probation can protect her now. You just have to say something, just one sentence, one word, They'll listen. Still, I didn't interrupt. I let her walk every step down the path of persuasion, one I had once walked endlessly, alone, to no avail. You're her sister. And after all, you have power others don't. If not for me, then do it for her. She paused, waiting for my heart to soften, then added in a lowered voice, your family. Madison, blood, not strangers. I looked out the window. Beyond it was the Capitol lawn, bathed in soft sunlight, the place where I had spent countless hours in my first year in office, reviewing policy briefs alone. I had gone from being uninvited to family dinners to someone who could shape legislation impacting thousands of families. And none of it came from a phone call from my mother, or a referral from my sister, or a single embrace from anyone in that household. I brought the phone closer, speaking slowly, clearly, gently, like a whisper. The daughter you once called a failure cannot erase the consequences you created. No bitterness, no emphasis, just a simple truth. And for the first time in my life, I felt my calm wasn't a defense, it was freedom. The line went quiet. No more justifications, no more pleading. Just a long pause, and the sound of disconnection. I no longer needed their approval. I no longer needed their apologies. In truth, I never had. What I had once wanted was simply to be seen, as a person with inherent worth, not someone who needed to become a gentler version of herself to be kept within a family. And now, with every mask fallen, I knew that my choice to stay silent wasn't because I was cold, but because, for the first time, I was certain I owed no one the softness they never earned. I ended the call, closed the window, and returned to the policy report on juvenile monitoring system reform. Numbers, stories, lives waiting for a system that listens, without needing anyone to beg. I had never been given that, but now I was helping to create it, for those less fortunate than me. And maybe, for the first time, I truly understood forgiveness isn't saving the past. It's letting go of the need to remake it. A few days after that final call from my mother, I received an express envelope from a publishing house in New York. Inside was a special edition of Civic Insight magazine. The cover was black and white, with only one photograph: me, seated in the last row of the courtroom, eyes fixed on the judge's bench, while my mother and Julia were still turning around, their faces frozen in a moment of stunned realization. The photo was titled "The Carter Courtroom Moment." There was no sensational headline, no flashy colors, just a moment, frozen, where every old order had unraveled, and silence became the loudest declaration in a room long filled with voices that spoke for the wrong people, for the wrong reasons. I left the magazine on the table. Next to it was an invitation from Columbia Law School. They wanted to include Julia's case in their course Power Behavior in Legal Spaces. In the letter, the department chair emphasized, what we want our students to learn isn't in what was said, but in the silent movement of power and presence. That same week, the Oregon State Ethics Council sent me an invitation to speak at their annual conference. The theme, Presence and the Boundaries of Power in Family and Public Leadership. At the bottom of the letter, someone had handwritten a note. Not everyone has the composure to make an entire system listen, by saying nothing at all. I read those words without smiling, because I knew what they were acknowledging wasn't me. But a moment when a name once considered a burden within a family became a presence no one dared dismiss again. The name Carter, for years, had been associated with Julia, with the parties, the local news articles, the gold-embossed cards my mother mailed out every holiday. And I, though I bore the same name, was always the leftover part, quiet, invisible, never mentioned in the same breath. And now, they, the very people who had written me out of the family story, were living in a world where that name no longer represented what they could control. I never spoke a word in that courtroom, never took the stand, never protested, never claimed justice, but by choosing to be present, I changed the air in that room and inadvertently forced everyone to reconsider what they once believed wasn't worth seeing. No defense needed, no tears, no explanation, just a name, at the right time, in the right place. Carter is no longer a name whispered only in reference to Julia at family gatherings. It is now a legal case file, a socio-political study, a political ethics lesson, and a reminder that you can be erased from your family's dinner table, but still write your name onto a document the entire system is required to sign. I used to think power came from holding a title, but in truth, it begins the moment you no longer need anyone to grant it to you. You just sit down and let the world realize you've been there all along. They just hadn't looked long enough to see you. Late that afternoon, after leaving a meeting with the Regional Education Policy Advisory Group, I received a message from the Capitol's front desk. Brief. Without explanation, someone's waiting for you in the lobby. Said it's personal. I descended from the third floor, unfazed. After all these years, nothing bearing the label family stirred me to quick reaction anymore. But when the elevator doors opened, I saw Julia, standing still in the white marble lobby. No makeup, no heels, no performance. Her hair was tied back simply. A gray overcoat clashed softly with the surroundings, and in her hand was a cream envelope, its edges slightly creased. She didn't walk toward me. She didn't flash a rehearsed smile like she used to when trying to ease the tension. She just stood there, waiting for me to approach. "I'm not here to ask for anything," Julia began. Her voice didn't shake. Nor did it insist. It was just tired. "I just wanted to thank you for not destroying me." I looked at her, not startled, not softened, just quietly receiving a truth that had come too late to call it change. Julia, the sister who once had every privilege I was never allowed to touch, was now learning how to stand on her own. No shield, no one to speak for her. I didn't ask why she came. I didn't ask what had happened after the hearing, the calls, the attempts at damage control from my mother, the pleas for legal aid. I knew Julia had faced them all. But the person in front of me today was not the Julia of those years past. She no longer carried the defiant glare or the words that reminded me of my place. I didn't hug her. I didn't touch her shoulder. I didn't pretend to be noble. I just said, slowly and clearly, "Don't try for me. Try for the person you become when no one's watching." That sentence wasn't advice. It was a boundary, a mirror. Julia gave a small nod. She said nothing more, just handed me the envelope. "I found some old photos, from before everything got complicated," she said, then turned and walked away. I stayed there, envelope in hand, not opening it. The lobby doors closed behind her, like a soft punctuation mark. Not a reconciliation, not quite an ending, just an honest presence, rare in a family long built on appearances. I looked down at the envelope. Buried memories didn't need to be unearthed all at once. They only needed to be acknowledged, at the right time, by the right person, and today. Julia had done what my mother never dared to do, looked at me without defense. I turned, walked back to the elevator. The doors closed behind me. Each floor we passed felt like peeling away another layer of old memory, not to forget, but to glance back one last time, with eyes no longer wounded. Julia didn't say sorry, but sometimes, knowing you were wrong, and standing silently in front of that truth, is enough to begin again. Not as sisters like before, but as two women, who know exactly who they have to keep moving forward for. That night, I came home later than usual. The November wind in Salem slipped through the window cracks like a quiet reminder that winter was coming, though I no longer kept track of time the way I once did. I set my bag on the chair, turned on the soft amber light in the living room, and finally opened the envelope Julia had given me. Inside were 4 old photographs, the paper already yellowing at the edges, the corners slightly curled with time. The first photo was of Julia and me sitting on the front steps of our porch, both of us grinning wide, hair messy from playing under the sprinkler. The second was from Julia's 8th birthday. There was a cake. Our mother stood beside her. And me? I was in the back, half of my face obscured by the glow of a hanging light. The third was from a trip to the park. Julia sat on our father's shoulders, holding a red balloon. I stood beside them, shorter, holding a book in one hand. No one in the photo was looking at the camera, except me, and still, I was smiling. But the last photo was the one that made me pause the longest. I was about 9 years old, standing next to a small science fair display at school. My hair was tied to the side, oversized plastic glasses on my face, shirt buttoned all the way to the top. On the table was a cardboard model of the circulatory system, with a blue first place ribbon in the corner. No one stood beside me. No one posed in the photo with me. No gaze was turned my way. But I was smiling. A smile that didn't need an audience to justify its existence. I sat down, gently ran my fingers over the photo, then stood up and opened the drawer in the wooden cabinet beside my desk. Inside it was an empty oak picture frame I had never used. I placed the science fair photo into the frame, adjusting the tilt until it sat just right. Then I turned to the opposite shelf, where another photo stood. The day I was sworn in as governor of Oregon. Navy suit, hand raised, hundreds of people standing in applause on the Capitol lawn. I placed the two photos side by side. No captions, no explanations. A forgotten girl standing alone on a schoolyard. A woman no longer ignored, standing before a state legislature. Both were me. There was no leap between those two frames, only time, choices, and countless quiet steps forward. No one guided me, no one clapped, no one said, "We see you." But I kept going, because I knew that if I didn't learn to stand alone, I would forever live as someone waiting to be recognized by a family that never truly made space for me. That night, I didn't turn on the news. I didn't read another file. I just sat on the sofa, tea in hand, eyes resting on the two photos side by side. One memory no one held on to, one reality no one could deny. I no longer needed applause. I just needed to remember this even as a child. I knew how to smile, not because someone gave me joy, but because I believed I deserved it, no matter who was standing next to me. And that little girl, with her clear eyes and her ribbon-tacked poster board, had already taken one step ahead of me, teaching me that silence could wear the shape of victory. The next morning, I woke to soft sunlight filtering through thin curtains. No missed call alerts, no message pings, no false urgency from a past I'd already outgrown. I poured a glass of water, opened the window, took a deep breath, and blocked my mother's number. Not out of anger, not to make some dramatic point. I did it simply to protect the peace I had just found. A kind of peace that didn't come from forgiveness, but from no longer needing them to change in order for me to live as myself. The news of Julia's sentencing arrived via email from the court clerk. Her license was revoked, 2 years of probation, no leniency. No exceptions, no outside influence, not even from me. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel regret. I just stood still, and in that stillness, everything was redefined. I hadn't pushed Julia down, hadn't spoken ill of my mother, hadn't reopened any old wounds. But I didn't extend a hand either, all my life. They called me too cold, emotionless, the child who never smiled. But now, when I walk into state meetings, when I appear on public television, when I step up to speak at national conferences, they no longer dare call me those names. They call me what everyone else does, Madam Governor. And the point isn't that they've finally acknowledged me. It's that, for the first time, they are silent, no longer entitled to define me however they please. I used to beg to be heard. I used to hope, just once, that my mother would look at me without disappointment in her eyes. I used to believe that if I tried long enough, did well enough, behaved well enough, they would keep me. But then I learned, some doors don't need to be opened, you just walk around them. Now, as I sit in the governor's office, hand resting lightly on the dark wood desk, I don't think about the dinners where I was seated in the shadows. I think about the little girl in the photo, standing at a science fair no one clapped for, but still smiling, as if the light within her was all she needed to brighten the silence around her. There is no grand finale, no applause, no tearful reunion, just me, and the truth, sharing the same space, with no need for witnesses. And that's enough, because when you no longer have to beg to be seen, you've already rewritten the whole story, not with words, but by living in a way that no one can ever forget your name again.